Mascolo, but you have a career as investigative reporter, editor of The Spiegel, and now the innovative project of cross-media cooperation within Germany, which we all look at with excitement. But I also heard you had some time as a lecturer in the US, so you know both sides of the Atlantic. Say Hersh, we don't need much introduction. There are so many awards, we don't count them. Welcome. Monika Bäuerlein has just been introduced. She is also a German-American, so a hybrid with one leg in each continent, and could contribute to the comparisons. And then Andrew Lehren, who is at the New York Times, and who has a very strong record of investigative journalism, from the small local New York to the large stories. And with this panel here, the sort of starting question was, if you look at the United States, the IRE, the equivalent to Netzwerk Recherche, was founded in 1976, Netzwerk Recherche in 2001. And the Center for Investigative Reporting was founded in the 70s. And the Center for Investigative Reporting here in Germany was published last week. So is Germany like a quarter of a century behind? And maybe we could start with Mascolo and Boyle a bit so that we can have a comparison. Is Germany 25 years behind the US in investigative reporting?
No, I don't think so. I believe Germany is not as bad as people make it sometimes. What are the roots of investigative journalism in Germany? It simply didn't exist until the end of the war. But the very idea what a free press in Germany should be was founded by the British and by the Americans. So many newspapers or news magazines, like my magazine Spiegel, for which I worked almost 25 years, they have a strong tradition in investigative journalism. And they learned it from the British and from the Americans. And the very idea is to control those who are holding the power. So I believe we are not as bad on this side of the Atlantic. We came a little late by having our own organizations like Network for Research, but that doesn't mean that investigative journalism isn't existing in this country here. There's no doubt that we can always do better. And I was pleased to hear what Monika said this morning. I think it's absolutely right. There's a growing tradition of people see a need to do more investigative journalism in the media here in Germany, and I believe that we are on a pretty good track here.
I agree. It's not even, I would say there's not even a unified, there's not even a single curve for investigative journalism, even in the US, a curve that you could be behind. In that way, there have been periods of bloom and renaissance and periods of cutbacks, and we just saw some pretty dramatic cutbacks the last few years, and we may now be seeing a bit of a renaissance in Germany. The trajectory has been different, but there is a strong tradition of watchdog journalism, if we want to cast it a little more broadly and really look at the role of reporters as holding the feet of the powerful to the fire. And there are different roots here. There is more of a tradition of the journalist as participant in the debate, and as a critic, him or herself, rather than an observer and a describer. But that also brings us really interesting forms of investigative journalism that, probably contributed to the fact that undercover reporting has, in some ways, a stronger presence and a stronger tradition here, because journalists would say, I see something that strikes me as wrong, and I'm going to expose it, rather than I see a law being broken, and I'm going to show how. So there are, I'd say they're not even exactly comparable so much as coming at some of the same goals, speaking truth to power from different traditions.
This is an interesting observation, that you see the German journalists more as a participant in the debate, whereas US journalists consider themselves more observers. Would that ring a bell with you? Are you as journalists more observers?
All I know is that after 9/11, I think Spiegel in particular did a hell of a lot better than the American press in reporting on what was going on in the American wars in Afghanistan, and particularly the lead up to the war in Iraq. And so there was, I think Europe led the way, really. The Brits weren't much good because they were in the house, and so most of the American press was in the house. That is, they supported the war, and if you didn't support the war, you were quiet about it. So I always had a warm spot for Spiegel. You know, there was a lot of talk, remember, of making the Spiegel turning an American edition. That was being seriously considered. They would have all been broke by now because we're all broke. And by the way, that seems to me the elephant in the room is when you talk about investigative journalism, who's going to pay for it? Because there's just not very much money out there anymore. It's a very serious issue.
So the funding is the main difficulty.
Well, yeah, it's expensive because often if you make a commitment, you have to be in a position of saying it's not working and throwing away $50,000 or $100,000 plus salaries. And papers don't do it. So often stuff that, you know, today is a crazy world because tweeting and the internet and startup news has both good and bad. And the good is clear because you get a tremendous new influx of voices, and these are voices that don't have a big infrastructure, so they can presumably afford at some point to do more serious work. On the other hand, I was just saying the other night, you 3 o'clock in the morning and you're walking by having had too many beers and you go past the White House on a Sunday morning at 3 and there's a light on and you tweet light on in the White House. The next thing you know, it's tweeted all over the world. What's going on? Lights on in the White House, some crisis going on. You have that element too, which it feeds on itself, and it's you know, like the yellow submarine, self-eating.
But you point at...
I'm not answering your question because I don't know enough to.
You point at funding being the main problem. Maybe we can just take a round. What would you consider the main problem for investigative journalism seen from the New York Times?
Do you mean like the problems that we face just trying to do our work at the New York Times?
What are the main obstacles?
The main obstacles. Well, I always feel like when you talk about the New York Times, it's kind of this unusual thing that is different than other newsrooms. I mean, we're very fortunate. It's a place that sees investigative reporting as part of its DNA. The support and encouragement we get from our editors is enormous. So, but I've also done a lot of work with IRE, the U.S. Organization, and I know that where the New York Times is a different place. But that said, you still have to convince your editors, you know, that you have good stories, that you're able to deliver these stories. And for many journalists at other organizations, like Cy was saying, you know, funding is an issue, getting time is an issue, you know, and being able to establish for younger journalists, being able to establish your track record that you can deliver these kinds of stories. You know, I often wonder, you know, for younger journalists these days, starting off, where are the outlets that you can, you know, best show that you're capable of doing this work to then go on to other places and, you know, keep doing more and better stuff.
So the young generation, would you agree that the main problem is how we get the young generation aboard, Monika?
Get a younger generation into the field, or get a younger
What is the main obstacle for investigative journalism seen from your point of view?
Money.
Money.
Money. Always has been, always will be. I mean, there was never enough money for investigative reporting. You know, it used to be that we found a way. It's never made money. Nobody will ever make money with investigative reporting. I hope Pierre Omidyar is not listening. But it was always something that was subsidized by revenue streams from other parts of journalism. And investigative reporting played a different role. It played, you know, it gave prestige to publishers. It made everybody feel better about, you know, some of the crap that we were putting out in other parts of the magazine or other parts of the paper and other parts of the broadcast. It, you know, served the part of us that wants to pursue a higher purpose. It still does all those things, and it still does not make money. So now we just have to find different ways to make no money. That's why some of us are in nonprofits where it's, you know. Cards are on the table.
You're looking for a different way of doing investigative journalism with this new cooperation between two public service broadcasters and one commercial newspaper. How did that come about? Is this a new way of trying to find resources, the way I see it from the outside? Resources to the...
First of all, it's the idea, or it's trying to do more in a cooperation, to bundle several smart people, let them do large researches together and then present it together. But let me first answer your other question. So what's the state of affairs for investigative journalism? I would say not so bad whenever it comes to huge worldwide stories. I believe the competition today is even bigger than it ever was. The Guardian jumped in, for example. The foundations are coming. So there's a lot going on whenever it's a real huge story. What I found worrisome is the question, who is doing it on the local and on the regional level? So, and this is especially for those who are interested in the field of investigative journalism, those who are a little bit younger. I mean, they will not start with WikiLeaks, and they will not start with Edward Snowden. They usually start as a local or a regional reporter. And if this field is drying out, if we don't hear what is local corruption or what is going on in a state or in a city, this would be pretty bad. So I hope that everybody understands that, especially this local and regional investigative journalism is very important.
Maybe we can go back to Andrew. When we talked yesterday to prepare for this session, you mentioned the investigative mindset, and you had some very nice examples from the Times.
Yeah, but if I could just, one thing about what Georg was saying was that I teach an investigative journalism class at a university in New York City, and one thing that I have seen younger journalists doing, by the way, is becoming more involved in taking their careers into their own hands. So I have several students who've been fortunate. They've won some national awards doing work as students. They've since gone on to start their careers. They've actually not gone to a large media organization. They go now to special nonprofits and get grants to go from project to project. And two students in particular who've done great work have just gotten a Kickstarter funding. You know, they went online, created a Kickstarter account for their next investigative project. So there are alternative ways that people are getting things out there, and maybe that's one alternative. Should I answer your question now? Yeah. So investigative mindset. You know, one of the things that I think when we talk about younger journalists is, you know, not expecting Snowden files or WikiLeaks to fall in your laps, but how you approach stories day in and day out. What I was telling you yesterday was how I had gone through a horrible stretch at work where I was doing some very intense stories, and I just felt like I needed a break. I went to our sports department. I said, could I just write about marathoning for 2 or 3 weeks just to have a break? And so I did the usual things I like to do as an investigative reporter. I believe we need to, you know, do original reporting, find things that no one else has written about before. And this is part of why people buy the New York Times. You're going to read something that perhaps you haven't read before. I got some records, I started going through things, and I realized that even in the seemingly simple world of marathoning, things were not making sense. And to put it graphically, if you could picture it, if you run the New York City Marathon, you start off in Staten Island, you go through Brooklyn, Queens, into Manhattan, and then you curl up, you go to the Bronx, and then loop back down into Central Park and finish there, and it's all a wonderful day. I went through the records, and what I realized that as an investigative reporter, what I was finding was that this is how the New York City Marathon is really run for dozens and dozens of people every year. They start off in Staten Island, they go over the bridge, and then they get into Brooklyn, and then a few people take the subway. And then they go into Queens, and then some more people get on the subway. And then as they curl in over the bridge into Manhattan, they bleed into the crowd. A bunch of people bleed into the crowd. And then they magically reappear in Central Park. and then they cross the finish line, and they collect their medal, and they're very proud for it. And I just thought, this is hysterical. I couldn't believe it. And I called up the race organizers, and I said, I'm going through the documents, and this is what I think I'm finding. And they said, well, that's the dirty secret of marathons, is that this dozens and dozens of people cheat. I told this once to a group of journalists in the Netherlands, and I said, by the way, I'm pretty sure you could do this in any city in the world. If you want to do this at the Berlin Marathon. I explained the whole methodology later to them. They went and they did it for the Rotterdam Marathon and had great fun. But again, investigative mindset. So we always push ourselves, okay, this is amusing, a bunch of people cheat at every marathon, no one ever quite knows about that. What's the harm, what's the foul, why do we really care? Well, let me tell you about the story about Alan Miller. Alan Miller is a guy who's about as New York City marathon as you can get. He's running it for 25 years. He gets dressed with the guys from the New York City Police Department. He, finishes the race and he goes to Mickey Mantle's, one of the legendary bars outside next to Central Park. He would have won his age group that day that I was going through the records. He would have been among the 60-year-old men who would have run the fastest that day. And he did not get the privilege of celebrating and knowing that he won. Instead, that privilege went to a man named Hermes Lupi. And if I could show you visually, if I showed you a picture of Hermes Lupi, he's an Italian, and on paper he's 61 years old, but the real Hermes Lupi sold his bib number for 300 euros to a 25-year-old Italian who proceeded to run the race like a 25-year-old Italian. I tracked down Alan Miller, and he said, "You're the first journalist who's ever called me." And he said, that was the race of my life. That was the best day of my life. And I didn't get to celebrate it with my friends. The drinks would have been on me. And instead, now I have cancer. I can never run another marathon again. And even in a little way, in a story that only took a week or so, this is how I think when I talk about the investigative mindset. And so when I find myself now these days, we just did a big story, it'll be part of a series, looking at the military hospitals across the country. That same mentality that will take examining the military's health system is the same mentality for something as simple as how we go about thinking about marathoning. So for younger journalists or any journalists out there, what we hope is that you all have this kind of DNA, that you're always critically thinking about everything you're looking at, whether it's seemingly simple or more complicated.
How's your marriage?
20 years.
Oh, it's tough. I mean, because when you run around thinking the way you think, you get into a lot of trouble.
Well, my daughter put it very happily. One time when I was working in television, she saw a story that I did, and she looked at me and she said, "Daddy, why don't you ever work on any happy stories?"
Well, is it fulfilling?
Yeah, it's great.
And maybe to follow up on the question of mindset, what you mentioned before of seeing a difference between the US and Germany, where journalists in Germany consider themselves part of society and maybe even an actor, whereas in the US they are observers. I found that a very interesting difference, and I recognize what I've read with scholars. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Like, do you have an example?
Well, it did, on this same, I don't have a very good example off the top of my head, and I would actually punt to Georg Mascolo, who can probably think of a few, but it does strike me that, the conversation on this podium yesterday about this same time was about activism, and, that's a conversation that I've heard a million times if I've heard it once in the US, and it pretty much goes the same way. There's always that tension between doing journalism that will have impact in the world somehow, and that you are being dishonest if you don't acknowledge that the impact is part of what you seek. Whether it's a specific, it shouldn't be a specific political change, but it certainly is, you do this work because you want to see something change, because you see something that is not right, and you want people to know about it, and the implication is always that knowledge will make change. So based on this on this expectation of impact that is most pronounced in all of journalism in investigative reporting. I would say people in Germany versus in the US come at it somewhat differently. German journalists come at it perhaps more unapologetically, more frankly, and that can also lead to problems, especially when power corrupts. Journalistic power also corrupts. When you don't have the sanction of the profession putting you back in line, when it seems as if you are becoming more of an advocate than a journalist, that can cause problems. But I don't think it's necessarily an either or. It's either way is risky if you don't handle it right and if you let your power get to your head.
But isn't impact what we all want? I mean, if we invest a lot of time to unveil some wrongdoings or whatever, we would like this to be heard. We would like someone to react on it.
Over the years, it's hard to tell what's going to have an impact and what isn't. When I worked at the New York Times, there were stories that were done, I thought, that were not necessarily written by, I had a colleague named Les Galb that wrote some amazing stuff about arms control talks, and nobody paid attention. It depends on which, the whole activism thing, it's complicated because you're lucky in Germany in the sense that you're not committed to basically destroying societies everywhere you go, which is a good thing. And in my country, we have a little problem with that issue. And you don't ever hear the word morality ever expressed by an American politician. There's no such. Our actions in Iraq were not immoral. We just destroyed a country and we declared the war over and we left. And now, of course, it's back. It never really stopped, and we pretend it stopped. And so it's very hard to separate your feelings about justice and injustice from what you report. In other words, in terms of activism, I began covering the Vietnam War. I got interested in Vietnam as a kid, as a young reporter, working in Chicago. I started reading the newspapers every day on the war. And when I began to start covering the war for the Associated Press in the middle 60s, it was still seen as we were fighting communism. And it became clear to me, and my own personal view was that we were committing essentially with this body count business to get ahead to get from being a lieutenant colonel to a colonel. You had 6 months with a unit that you ran, and the big measurement was body count, how many people you killed. And it still is in the special operations community. You're judged by how many you kill in 3 months when you're on the field. And it's insane. It's insanity, and it leads to mass murder. And so you get to the point of view where you say, hey, this is an enterprise that's really, A, it's not going to win, and B, it's not only making victims of the people you're killing, but the people who are doing the killing. So how do you separate that feeling from what you write? I mean, that's hard. And so can you divorce yourself? So in Germany, since your foreign policy is right now, I think it's I'm totally fascinated by what the role of Germany with Russia right now, and Merkel's role with Putin. I mean, it's so interesting, and it's such a healthy relationship in the sense that the option is to try and get something accomplished that's useful, and it's not you're not playing Cold War as we are in America right now. So I think in a way, German reporters, when they go after something, they have a cleaner mindset. They're really out to, as was just said, to fix something that's wrong. In America, it's complicated because you find yourself having moral thoughts about immorality as a journalist. Yes, and that's a pretty arrogant thing. Why should my particular view be so, and it's inevitable. So it's a whole different complication. I will say this about the BND and the BIF. If anybody thinks that the German intelligence services don't know everything Snowden produced, you're living in a fantasy world. You're in as deep as you can be as for an ally. Even today, right now, you're an incredible ally for a lot of stuff going on under the table with us. You're most useful. The BND is one most useful service for the American services because you're discreet, you don't leak. There's still, oops, despite the stuff that George and his people put out. George, I used to know George, and George, that was the heydays. when you guys, in the early 2000s. Don't you think so, Der Spiegel, when you were just bopping around, writing all those good stories that we weren't writing in America? I'm talking about post 9/11.
We had some good days, yeah.
We had some great days back then.
One of the next questions I had here is about courage.
Courage?
It's last year you gave an interview where you said there were some chicken shit editors who didn't dare.
Well, with all due respect to the New York Times.
Timidity in journalism and so on. And so this leads to the question of courage among editors and among journalists.
I think you were recommended to fire, was it 90% or 95% of the editors?
I think if 90% of the editors and publishers disappeared in America,
I like the idea because I was already out. So.
You'd already been fired.
You're back in now, so what now?
He actually likes, he introduced me to some of his reporters the other night. He actually gets along with them, and he treats them like human beings. I don't know what's wrong with them. You know, it's not, they're not serfs. What I saw at the New York Times, and I will say, my colleague here is absolutely right. There's always a tremendous, not only in the New York Times, I judge some contests, and I will say this, that a lot of local papers in America anyway do still put a lot of emphasis on, particularly in the Southwest, on issues of water, issues of local politics. So we do have, it's diminished, we do have, George's point is very real. You need people that come and have done local, regional reporting on investigative stuff to come and step into a broader, you can't just fly up from an internet, I'm sorry, you can't, or from a startup. It's really hard, I think, to get to the point where you can start working for a major outlet. You have to really have had some experience, and if you don't have the feeders, you know, it's like if you don't have feeder, you know, second, third division clubs feeding up to the big boys in football here, it doesn't work. So it's the same process. But I just saw at the New York Times, in general, I was there about 8 or 9 years. I saw the promotions went to the ones who were timid, who went along. And so in general, and I'm just picking the New York Times because it happens everywhere. In general, in America anywhere where I've seen it happen, I saw it at the Associated Press where I worked. In general, senior people don't like people giving them bad news. And so you promote people that will avoid giving you bad news. And we have a president that's absolutely, my president is absolutely, he can't tolerate bad news from what I understand. You don't give them bad news.
There's some news that are too close to some dangerous truths that can't be published.
No, it's not that. It's not that.
Too close to power.
It's just self-censorship is the evil of our profession. It's the evil. It's the most significant evil we have is we censor ourselves. There are things we don't do ourselves that we should be doing. And if you don't have an editor that has a different point of view, that tells you, don't worry, I've got your back, if you will, you can walk away from tough things. And so I find that the hardest problem is to free yourself, to not be afraid. And I'm not talking about courage that in any way is courage. I mean, try reporting in some countries in Africa where you write a story and your wife and children are gone the next day. That's courage. We don't have that kind of, it's not physical courage. Yeah, you can be in a war zone, but you're basically pretty careful and pretty protected. You're not out there, with the troops in the front line. If you are, you're there in an official visit. So it's not as dangerous. I applaud people to do it, and I've done it too. But there's nothing quite as scary as having a very major story go online or go in the newspaper, and for which you don't have a document. And so Snowden was a document. I knew about Abu Ghraib for 6 months before I could write it because I had to find something in writing, because who's going to believe that the daughters of the daughters, families sometimes would get arrested and they would take the daughters in, and the daughters were writing letters to their brothers saying, please come kill me because I've been defiled by the Americans in prison. And sometimes that's nothing more than taking a picture of them. There's a different societal rules in the Middle East. And so I knew all that. People told me about it. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch had written about it. But how are you going to convey this in a way that will work in America and for the world? You need a document. And so that's the hardest part. And when you don't do something without a document, that's scary as hell.
May I jump in here for a second? Thanks for the flowers, Dad. German journalists have a clearer mindset. I have to say, I believe we have our own shortcomings, and I only want to mention two. The first is too often now, whenever it comes to a simple news story, the simple idea of finding something out which nobody else knows, what I call journalism or news, is considered to be investigative journalism. So we don't do it ourselves. We leave it to an investigative team, which is is an idea I don't like. I mean, everybody who is working as a journalist should be eager to find out something nobody else knows. And then you might call it investigative journalism, special projects, and that's fine. But if we come to a separated world, separated newsrooms where you have those who believe that their job would be to report what is already out, and those who do investigative journalism, I believe it would be a pretty bad idea. The second thing is, I always admired American journalists for being fair, usually pretty fair with each other. So if somebody has a story, he gets an attribution for that. It was first reported by. There's also harsh criticism in the American media with other news organizations and stories. And it goes much further than we see it here in Germany usually. But I think the game is fair altogether. So it's you do a fair reporting. Who had a story? You might criticize it if you have to criticize this, which is something we don't have here. Too often you see that somebody is breaking a huge story, and 5 minutes later somebody's coming and saying, you know, I know it myself. I have it, and it's my information. So this is something which we shouldn't do here. We should compete with each other, but we should treat each other as colleagues and be fair with each other.
Yeah, that's an important one.
In Plato's Republic.
Huh?
In Plato's Republic, yes.
You mentioned self-censorship, and maybe we could try to think about how can we, and then combining with what you said, Georg Mascolo, how do you say, developing this into all fields and out of the just investigative teams. So how can we convey this message to all journalists, to particularly young journalists, to not self-censor them and to not park their investigative mindset with an investigative team, but adopt it for each ourselves? How should we convey this to the next generation?
How do we do it? By waking up early on a Saturday morning and coming here and talking about it.
I have to agree with what Cy and Andrew both said, that the pipeline is a real problem, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic. You know, that there are plenty of people coming into journalism, but we had structures in place for a fairly, you know, not forever, but for a few decades, where people could find their feet in the profession, could run into the things that everybody runs into at some point sooner or later, and have other people, experienced people around saying, no, you don't do that, yes, you do this. You know, we had a panel yesterday on quote authorization, which, you know, in the US, fortunately, is not standard. And but every year I deal with interns. You know, we have a wonderful fellowship program, and I deal with our fellows when their first source says, you know, I expect you to let me review what I'm telling you before you use it. And I'm there, and I can say, no, you can tell them I'm not allowed to do that. That's your excuse, and they're fine, and hopefully they'll carry that forward into their next newsroom, and one day they'll be the editor doing that. But we have, when those structures are all dissolving, and there's no one to provide that advice and to, you know, provide the bullshit detector and all the other things that you need to find your footing as an investigative reporter, we have a real problem.
What would you suggest? I mean, when I talked with Andrew yesterday, he talked about his students finding entrepreneurial ways of establishing themselves, working for grants, etc., etc. How do we, the experienced generation, go about passing on this knowledge in such an environment? Any ideas?
Well, I think when Georg was saying, you know, you come here on Saturday mornings, I mean, in the United States, a group like IRE, which I think you all have been to, you know, it's really how we spread all of this. It becomes, you go to several conferences, it's as good as a master's degree you could get at a university in journalism. And it's a way that I know for myself, I feel like I'm a product of those conferences. And so seeing these kinds of conferences, you know, here in Germany, in other European countries, these are not just social gatherings. And these are hugely important for letting people know that it's okay to do this work. And not only that, here's the actual nuts and bolts about how you can go about doing these stories, or how you may work on a Snowden Files story or a WikiLeaks story. You know, this is how we go about doing it, and that's how, at these conferences, you set the table for the next generation. And our generation, too.
And our generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you agree there?
I was just thinking what George said about every reporter being an editor. I think the problem, George, is often certain parts of the newspapers don't really want news. They want, you know, the city editor sometimes will not encourage people to be the kind of reporter they should be, because there's a risk involved in writing these kind of stories. There's a risk of being wrong. There's a risk of getting the publisher angry. There's a risk, you know, of getting going after somebody that puts a lot of money into the newspaper advertiser. There's a risk involved in these things, and long before you were at the New York Times, there was a rule in the op-ed page that you couldn't break news there. The op-ed page in the New York Times used to be that if you wrote a piece for them, you couldn't have news in it. That was the rule. Then they had to take it to the news editor. I mean, it was just bizarre. This is, I mean, these kind of rules take place. There was, so there is an inherent contradiction sometimes between the mindset of the daily editor and the investigative editor. And the daily editor could never be an investigative editor because he doesn't want to take the chances that an investigative editor would take. And so it's the mindset too. And again, I talk a lot into journalism groups in Washington or in the States sometimes, and I always ask daily reporters what they do. And they always, the average daily reporter on a beat in Washington, we were just talking about it this morning with somebody from development, and you start off you have a story, and you first have to report it online at noon, then you have to update the online, and then you have to do something for the web page, then you have to do the in-house interview for the in-house person, then you write the story. And you know, how do you have time to report it? I can't believe what happens in modern journalism because it's so multimedia now. For daily reporters, it must be really very hard to get your work done and get it done the way it should be. You know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. Do you?
Well, I can't believe I'm disagreeing with Cy Hersh, so forgive me, but I have to take issue a little bit with. I think we can actually have daily editors and daily reporters do investigation. I think it's not always rewarded by the newsroom structures that have existed, but it's. I think actually moving to digital gives us all these opportunities where we have reporters, day in and day out coming to their editors saying, I think there's a lot more to this story than the 2-hour blog post that you asked me to write, and I want to spend, a couple more days.
And then what happens then?
And then, I love our editors, so I think, they're mostly really smart, and they're in a position to say, either, write the damn blog post, I don't believe you. But that very rarely happens because they also have a good rapport with their reporters. They can say, come back tomorrow and tell me if where you're going to find the thing you're going to find. Or they can say, why don't you write a quick blog post that doesn't disclose the amazing thing you found, and we'll see if it flushes out more sources and more stories. There's all these ways in which we can use the daily flow to support the longer-term project that didn't used to be available to us. I think it's, I think you're absolutely right. When you have people who are looking at the bottom line and who are looking at feeding systems rather than getting at the truth, you don't get that. But
the experience I have, and this is, I'll speak to, there'll be fellowships, night fellowships. There's a bunch of fellowships that rotate reporters from out of the city for 3 weeks, or they come 1 day a week. And I've always spoken. There's a set groups that I've spoken to for years. I go and do an hour, and we just yap and talk about it. And I always go to that issue of what do you do when you're covering a beat and you find a story. And what I find is, in so many cases, the resistance to altering the daily beat is really high, higher than, you may be in your form of nirvana, and great if it is. You find editors. Most of the people, people who work for USA Today, these big, the Philadelphia Inquirer, they don't get the time. They're told they have to really make a hell of a pitch to get the story going. They can do it, but they have to work really hard. And the idea of being told, go off and see what you have, it doesn't exist anymore. It's come back with it. Nobody wants to they don't want to give you a week to go see if it's there. They don't, that's the instinct, is to say no. And that, we're talking on a really micro level. We're talking about really at the lowest level. You can have a good idea, and you often don't get a chance, unless you want to do it on your own, to go and flesh out the story. And I'm hearing that just anecdotally, and I don't like it. It scares the hell out of me.
In your speech just before, you mentioned a new infrastructure evolving in the U.S. Would the newsroom, or the division between news and investigative, be less harsh in some of these new organizations?
I think it has to be. I mean, I'm just by disposition an optimist. Life's too short to be miserable and to believe that my profession is doomed, and so I tend to focus on the places where I see that organizations that are failing are doing the things that Cy describes, are not giving their reporters rope, are pursuing a path that is giving them fewer and fewer readers and fewer and smaller and smaller audiences. And I think the newsrooms that are succeeding are dissolving, not only the wall between print and digital, which should have been gone in any self-respecting newsroom quite some time ago, but tankers are hard to turn, but are also dissolving these boundaries between day-to-day news and investigative reportage. And I think where the best reporting really happens when it's it's like in physics class where you have a sinus curve, and you start with a tidbit and then you get more and more and more, and you might be publishing bits of it iteratively online, and then you finally have your doorstop of a major investigative project, and then you have the fallout that you also cover, and maybe you get a whole nother scoop. I mean, the NSA story is the perfect case in point, where that story is nowhere near, has nowhere near even reached the flattening part of that curve. I think it can happen. It just isn't.
I don't want to break up Nirvana here, but let's see. The New York Times still puts up probably the best newspaper you could argue in the world. Still a very solid newspaper. I don't see circulation jumping out of its skin. I don't see the Washington Post, which has been adding reporters since this wacko Bezos brought it. I don't see them. I have no idea what he wants with the newspaper. I don't. Billionaires collect. Maybe he thinks it's a yacht, and I don't know. But anyway, so they're adding reporters. I don't see anything happening. The Guardian, we were talking, poor Luke, I'm going to invoke his name. The Guardian, that's not a secret. They're not making any money. Nothing happened. No, the world didn't turn over for them because they did the Snowden story. In fact, they were left, well, as Luke said yesterday, they were left buried alone by their fellow newspapers. So I'm not sure there's an immediate reward for this kind of quality that does exist, that should exist, that should exist more. I don't see the market responding. Really, I just don't see the market responding to better reporting. I don't see in America where we have the network television news is beyond contemptible. I don't see any outcry for better news. I don't see any calling. More tits and ass, everybody's happy with it. I just don't see any great progress happening in terms of the major media in America. The national magazines, we've lost Time Magazine, Newsweek, they're all gone. And so I don't see quality being rewarded, period. I don't see it.
Well, I wouldn't be so pessimistic.
I'm just being factual.
Do I see an immediate financial return for the New York Times or the Guardian? Yeah, you might be right with this conclusion. On the other hand, I have watched what the Guardian is doing since years now, and they became a real global brand. They can compete in the United States now. What is the reason for that? There's a pretty simple reason for that. Nobody was waiting for a Guardian in the United States, but they broke some huge stories, and they got a lot of attention, and their brand got a lot of attention. And I believe that one of the reasons why you see publishers, editors, CEOs investing in investigative journalism is that they're shooting exactly for this kind of attention. They want news because they know that presenting everything which is out anyway will not save you. No, not at all. Does it mean that this road leads to higher circulation, higher returns and profits? I'm not sure about that, but it's probably...
Why don't you use the word sustainability? Does it lead to sustainability? I'm not sure it does. There's no evidence
that we disagree since 15.
No, but there's no evidence that the Guardian has suddenly turned a corner and making money. There's no evidence that the New York Times is suddenly back to 1.4 million or 1.5 million.
But I believe the Guardian always lost money. I mean, now they are still losing money, but they're making great stories. And I would say this is, that's a progress in itself.
So what's going to happen is a bunch of crazy wacko billionaires are going to start buying up the newspapers. I don't know what the run into that. And they're going to be treated as toys, as I said. I don't know. That seems to be, or the state in America, the federal government's going to fund them.
Well,
Luke, you should come up before we are destroying your newspaper here.
What?
Okay. Great, good news.
Oh, great. Yes.
And we all work at nonprofits now. You know, when the New York Times sells you a digital subscription, they're not really selling you access to the newspaper. You can get access to the paywall is so porous you can get at it any which way. They are selling you the opportunity to support the journalism that you like. And people do that with public radio in the United States. People did it in Germany for many years with much higher subscription prices. There is that element too. There are going to have to be a certain number of users willing to finance this kind of journalism, and none of us knows how much of it they're going to finance. But we know some. We know it's not nothing.
But you're talking about a complete change in the model without acknowledging that it has to be. That's all. All I'm saying is let's get real. The model isn't working.
Yes.
So we've got to change it in dramatic ways. And so instead of talking, we should really be trying to figure out some way to structure a different model. That's what the focus should be, I guess, permanently, because it's hard for us to talk about it because it's so negative. But there is a reality. The very best journalism is not getting rewarded financially with readership. And the crap that goes on, in particular what drives me crazy, is network news. There's no demand to change it, make it better. There's no documentary news. I mean, thank God, Germany, you're very lucky. You have a great tradition. Well, also in Scandinavia, there's a lot of places. There's a great tradition of documentary television, reportage. We don't have that in America. We have a lot of, I think the problems are just overwhelming. And the future is pretty freaking scary, and we ought to be dealing with that more, and we're just not. Even at this conference, talk all you want about goody-goody money and all that stuff. The fact of the matter is, it isn't financially rewarding, and who's going to be running the newspapers in the next 3 or 4 decades? I don't know.
Let's open for questions here. Are there any questions or good suggestions on how we could make money? Please come to the microphone, introduce yourself, and shoot.
Sorry to make this an S&M thing.
My name is Peter Münder. I'm writing for the Culture magazine. It's an online magazine. I just wonder, I mean, instead of talking all the time about the future situation of journalism, I would like to ask Seymour Hersh, who discovered all the deficits, whatever happened to My Lai, and so on. And 40 years later, you were dealing with Abu Ghraib. And now we have a movie showing Donald Rumsfeld totally refusing to acknowledge any sort of mistakes having been made by the American government during the war or during the invasion of Iraq. My question is, in the long-range perspective, do you think, apart from investigative journalism, you need a different level, a moral level, to make sure you have change from just making an impact focused on a certain event to a long-range change, making sure that whatever has been disclosed by the investigative reporters was acknowledged, and there's a preparedness within, say, the political establishment to learn from these reports and to change their whole moral attitude.
You mean to learn?
I mean, was another point
You're
where you
suggesting
said
that
sorry?
politicians can learn from past mistakes?
Perhaps.
Are you suggesting
yes,
that
perhaps.
really?
Well, no.
What?
No, I was going to ask you
What?
if you don't ever come to a point where you say, I've reported this, I've discovered this, and whatever happened to it.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh openly, but let's see, the country that went into a war in Southeast Asia without knowing anything about the history and the culture, and then did it again in Iraq,
Well,
and
exactly.
now it's doing it again, and then did it again, and now did it in Libya. And you're expecting us to learn?
No, I'm.
There's just no.
What's
I
your
don't mean
attitude?
I don't
Yes.
mean to be rude to you, but the answer is that we're going to have an election, and we're going to have another president who's going to spend probably her 6 or 4 or 8 years either trying to kill an opponent or bomb a country. So there's no learning curve. There's no learning curve in any of this.
So is there
Not
a point,
in America anyway.
Is there a point for you where you say, I might as well give it in?
No.
I mean, you discovered so many things.
No, it's
and,
just
and
I have
it's
to
still
say
being continued.
I have to tell people, no, get in line. I have another atrocity to deal with this week.
Okay.
You know, I mean, more people. You know, the amazing thing about our business is, in America, everybody's moping and groping about crackdown on the press. People still, human nature, for some mysterious reason, really has noble moments. And people on the inside know when they're doing right or wrong. And so we become very important. And the thing that's so important about my profession is we have a world being run by and large by idiots, murderers, corrupt thieves, nincompoops. And so who's there to pick up the pieces? We have to be. We have to be so much better than we are because we can't count on leadership. We still have, in my country, we still play the Cold War game. We still think that the hip bone is connected to the jawbone. We think that Iran is connected to Syria, which is connected to Hezbollah, which is connected to Hamas. We think there's no independent thinking anywhere. We still think that. So we have so much primitive thinking in the world. And newspapers have one great ability, which is we're able to look beyond that. And, you know, the competence of the people you see here at this panel and this meeting all week, you're seeing the creme of the creme. People who really are thoughtful and God forbid, I wouldn't advocate we should be in government because we'd probably turn to be just as useless as everybody else in government. Government seems to have some sort of lowest common denominator. I don't understand it. But the idea that somebody's going to learn from Abu Ghraib about torturing people, do you think my country is not torturing people now? We just hide it better. Do you think we're not doing the same thing we were doing 10 years ago? We still have secret prisons. We still do renditions. We still kill people without warrant, without reason. We still prosecute the wrong people knowingly. Of course that happens. That's the way it works. Power somehow, at least in the modern world as I see it, is really a very, very negative thing. And we're what's there. We're the levers that are there. That's the beautiful function of the press. And that's why these things are so important, these kind of conferences, because we have to remind ourselves that despite all the problems, we are there to protect the world from the leaders of the world. That's what I really think. I really do believe that.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not making speeches.
Are there other questions? Nobody dares. So if we should sum up here, we talked before about one of the main problems being funding. But let's start from one end with you, Andrew. And if each of you could give just one important thing to a young student or a young fellow, what would you say to one of your students is the most important thing to take along to a career starting today?
I think of some of the things that I would say have been talked about a lot this morning already. You know, thinking critically, thinking outside the box, thinking, not relying on what other people are saying is how you should think, but thinking for yourself, digging deep, not being afraid, knowing that I understand what we were saying before about editors, but editors can also be incredibly nurturing and saying, you know, what have you got for me now? You know, sending you notes like, can you help me re-examine or dig into an issue? Knowing that there are people out there who will nurture you. Maybe they're few and far between. Maybe you'll be fortunate and they'll be concentrated in a place, but knowing that, you know, you can find your way in this profession, and that to look at conferences or events like these as places where you can go and get skills so that when you go back to your newsroom, you could even be that everyday reporter who does investigative stories.
Thank you. Monika, what would you give a young fellow along on the road?
The question I ask all of them is there anything else you could possibly want to do, because you might really want to consider that. And not even so much because it's hard to have a career and, you know, God forbid, support a family, which you know, at least the way the economy in the U.S. is going, you can do in virtually no other job either. But because it is a very, very hard job. There is a reason why there is sort of a quasi-cultish or quasi-religious element to it. It's a bit of a calling. You really should not be doing it if you have other things that you might really like to do. And so if you really think that this is what you have to do, it's what I say to them, then you'll find a way to make it happen. And they do.
Thank you. You said before self-censorship was one of the biggest enemies of a journalist. Is that what you would say to a young?
No, I would say two things to kids, and I do. I'd say the big thing is read before you write. You can't do it if you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, you got to really work hard. You've got to read things, and the second thing is get the fuck out of the way of the story. There's no such thing as a sensational story. Just write the story. If it's sensational, it'll come out. Just get out of the way of it. That's all.
Thank you.
Well,
going.
all has been said. There's only one thing I could add. Wake up early, never start digging, have your facts right, and love what you're doing because it's a beautiful job.
That's a really nice closing word. Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming.
Somebody's got it. Okay, I'll see you later. See you later. We have a... Yes. Yep.